She wore no rank, no name patch, no decorations. For 3 weeks she stood in their chow lines, scrubbed her own tray, and listened to every insult they didn't bother to lower their voices for. They called her a shadow, a nobody, a clerical mistake in plain fatigues. Then First Sergeant Colton Reeves made the last easy decision of his career. He put his hand on her shoulder and shoved. What happened next didn't just end careers. It rewrote the chain of command at Fort Blackridge from the ground up. If you've never subscribed to this channel, do it right now. Because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. Hit that like button, drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with me until the very end. You will not see this ending coming. The convoy had rolled back through the main gate at 0423, dust still bleeding off the vehicles, and Fort Blackridge was already awake by the time the last MRAP cleared the sensor line. That was the thing about ranger posts. They didn't sleep so much as rotate, some element always moving, always grinding, always loud in the particular way that combat-trained men are loud when they believe no one important is watching. Avery Sloan noticed that immediately. She'd noticed it on day 1, 3 weeks ago, when she arrived in a white government sedan with a single duffel bag and credentials that identified her as a contract logistics coordinator named A. Sloan, GS11, Support Staff, Administrative Annex. The credentials were real. The job title was not a lie exactly. It was just a very small piece of a much larger truth. She checked into the transient quarters block near the motor pool, a cluster of modular units that smelled like diesel and old carpet. Her room was 9 feet wide. The overhead light had a flicker that cycled every 40 seconds. She timed it on her first night, lying on her back on top of the covers in her clothes, staring at the ceiling with the focused stillness of someone who had learned long ago that rest and sleep were two different things. She did not complain about the room. She did not request a transfer to the visitor quarters, which were significantly more comfortable and sat empty 3 nights out of 5. She unpacked her duffel, 2 sets of plain unmarked fatigues, 1 civilian change of clothes, a worn paperback, a small leather notebook with a rubber band around it, and a toiletry bag. And she went to work. Fort Blackridge sat on a flat stretch of high desert in eastern Montana, close enough to the Canadian border that the wind in winter came down without asking permission. It was home to the 3rd Ranger Battalion's Delta Company and 2 attached support elements, roughly 400 personnel total, with a command structure that had spent the last 18 months building one of the most decorated operational records in the country. They were, by almost every measurable standard, exceptional. Avery had read their file 3 times on the flight out. 14 successful direct action missions in the past fiscal year, 0 friendly casualties in the last 6 months, PT scores in the 94th percentile across the board, 2 Silver Stars, 1 Distinguished Service Medal, and a Navy Cross that had been awarded to one of their attached JTAC operators during a joint operation she wasn't cleared to know the details of. She knew the details anyway. That was, in a narrow sense, her job. Her actual title, the one that existed in a separate system behind 2 additional security layers, was Senior Strategic Evaluation Officer, Joint Readiness Command, GS-15. She had held that position for 9 years. Before that, she had spent 11 years as an active duty officer with 3 combat rotations, a year embedded with a British SAS advisory unit in a country she still couldn't name in writing, and a classified assignment that had added 7 new gray hairs to the part of her temples and earned her a commendation that would never appear on any public-facing record. She was 41 years old. She looked, in plain fatigues with no insignia, like someone who filed maintenance requests. That was the point. The evaluation protocol she was running was called a Cultural Integrity Assessment, and it had no official name in any document that soldiers at Fort Blackridge would ever see. It had been developed quietly after a series of high-profile incidents at other installations, incidents where units with extraordinary tactical capability had demonstrated catastrophic failures in judgment, ethics, and basic human decency when they believed the cameras weren't rolling. The problem with extraordinary soldiers, in Avery's experience, was the same as the problem with any human being who had been told, consistently and loudly, that they were exceptional. They started to believe the hierarchy was permanent. They started to treat rank not as a temporary designation of responsibility, but as a fundamental statement about a person's worth. And when that happened, when a unit's internal culture began sorting people into those who mattered and those who didn't, The results in the field were predictably ugly. Not immediately. Not in ways that showed up on the metrics. But eventually, in the kinds of decisions that got people killed, in the moments where someone junior saw something wrong and said nothing because nobody had ever taught them that their voice mattered. Avery had seen it twice in her career. Both times she had been called in after the fact. This time, Joint Readiness Command wanted someone in before the deployment orders were cut. Fort Blackridge's Delta Company was 18 days out from a joint international exercise with 3 allied nations, the kind of operation where cultural failures didn't just embarrass, they fractured alliances that had taken decades to build. So they sent her in quiet, and for 3 weeks she watched. She ate in the main chow hall every morning at 0630 and every evening at 1730. She carried a clipboard and made marks on it, though the marks were not what they appeared to be. She walked the motor pool at odd hours, asking the mechanics questions about parts inventory that she already knew the answers to. She attended the public portions of 2 planning briefs, sitting in the back row, taking notes. She had coffee twice with the base's administrative chief, a warrant officer named Delgado, who was sharp and overworked, and who seemed mildly puzzled by her presence but too polite to press. She did not introduce herself to the Rangers. She did not need to. What she needed was to see them in motion, unguarded, uncurated, operating exactly as they operated when no one from outside the wire was watching. And she saw. She saw a staff sergeant refuse to hold a door for a motor pool mechanic who had his hands full with 2 toolboxes and a parts crate, then complain loudly that the motor pool guys were slow as hell when a vehicle wasn't ready for the morning's movement. She saw 2 junior rangers mimic the speech pattern of a South Korean liaison officer behind his back, not quietly, in the corridor outside the operations center, 7 feet from an open door. She saw a corporal with a service dog, a Belgian Malinois named after some call sign she didn't catch, get told to move to the end of a supply line because the dog was unprofessional in a logistics environment. The corporal was a handler assigned to the unit's K9 element. His dog was certified in explosive detection and had cleared 46 structures in the past 2 years. She wrote all of it down, not with judgment, with precision, because precision was what the report required, and the report was what the deployment decision depended on. The Chow Hall at Fort Blackridge was divided by an unwritten rule that every person on the installation understood. There was the general line, which served the full population, support staff, admin, mechanics, cooks rotating off shift, the occasional civilian contractor. The line was long and moved at a bureaucratic pace, and the food at the end of it was identical to the food at the other end. Then there was the Ranger priority line, which had no official designation but existed as firmly as if it had been painted on the floor. It was an informal arrangement, started years before by a previous command sergeant major who believed that combat armed soldiers with operational tempos should not wait 40 minutes for scrambled eggs. The sentiment was not entirely unreasonable, and in small unit context, the informality of it had probably been fine. What had grown around it was something else. The priority line had calcified into a symbol, a sorting mechanism, a daily visible reminder of who counted and who didn't. Support staff who accidentally stepped into it, usually new arrivals who didn't know the layout, were corrected with a sharpness that went well beyond operational necessity. Avery had watched it happen 4 times in 3 weeks. Each time the correction came from the same man. First Sergeant Colton Reeves, Delta Company, was 44 years old and built like someone had designed him with a specific purpose in mind and hadn't bothered with anything extra. He was 6'2", 210, carried his weight without excess, and moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had spent 22 years learning exactly how much energy each action required and spending nothing more. His service record was, by any honest measurement, extraordinary. Ranger School honor graduate. 3 combat rotations in the early years of the global war on terror. 2 more in advisory capacities. A Silver Star from a night operation in a valley whose name was still classified. The kind of man who had earned every piece of his authority through situations that would have broken most people. He was also, Avery had noted in her leather notebook on day 4, the single most consistent source of the behavior she was here to document. Not because he was cruel, not in the obvious, performative way. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed humiliating people for sport. He was the kind of man who had simply never been asked to look twice. His instincts had served him in combat. They were fast, reliable, and usually correct. He read situations in seconds and acted on those readings with confidence. In a firefight, that was survival. In a chow hall, it was something else. Tuesday morning, day 22 of Avery's assessment. She joined the general line at 0638, clipboard under her arm, tray in hand. The hall was at near capacity. The rotation from the morning PT block had just finished, and the night shift motor pool crew was coming off. The noise level was significant. Boots, voices, the industrial clang of the serving line, someone's radio crackling a weather report near the east wall. She was not in the Ranger priority line. She was standing at the point where the two lines converged near the coffee station, an ambiguous zone that existed because the hall's physical layout had been designed before the informal division took hold, and no one had ever bothered to put up signage. She had stood in this exact spot, in this exact way, on 2 previous mornings. Both times, a ranger had glanced at her, assessed her plain fatigues and absence of rank insignia, and moved around her with the silent efficiency of someone stepping around furniture. This morning, Colton Reeves was running late. She heard him before she saw him, not because he was loud, but because the noise around him changed. Conversations paused, posture shifted. The particular micro-adjustment that a room full of soldiers makes when someone with authority enters and they're not sure what kind of morning it is. He came through the east entrance at 0641, coffee thermos in hand, already scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who was constantly conducting informal accountability checks even when he didn't realize it. His eyes moved across the line, landed on Avery. She was looking at the menu board when it happened, though she was not actually reading the menu board. She was watching his reflection in the polished steel of the serving partition. She saw the assessment happen in real time. Plain fatigues, no rank, no name tape, standing in the Ranger line, or close enough to it that from his angle, with the convergence point doing what convergence points do, it read as the same thing. He made his decision in under 2 seconds. That was the part she would note later. Not that he made the wrong call, that he made any call at all without a single question. His boots found the floor in 3 measured steps. He came around the edge of the serving partition with the quiet authority of a man who had cleared rooms for 20 years, and he stopped 2 feet from her left shoulder. "You're in the wrong line." His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular texture of a voice that had never needed volume to be heard. Avery turned around. She moved without hurry, without the flinch that people usually produced when Colton Reeves came up behind them. She completed the turn at the pace of someone who had been expecting the conversation, which she had been. She looked at him. He was taller than her by a significant margin, and he was using that margin the way men sometimes did. Not aggressively, exactly, but deliberately, occupying the space between them in a way that made the space feel smaller. "Am I?" she said. 2 words. Even tone. No challenge in them, no deference either. Just a question returned for a question, which was perhaps the most disorienting thing she could have said. The line had gone quiet around them. Not all at once, these were soldiers, trained in situational awareness, and the shift happened in under 3 seconds as the people nearest the exchange registered what was happening and stopped making noise. Colton's eyes moved over her a second time, looking for rank, finding nothing. Processing the absence of it in the way that someone who had spent 2 decades reading rank would, as information that confirmed his initial read. "This is a designated priority line, Tukpan," he said. "Support staff and administrative personnel use the general—" "I know where the general line is," Avery said. She said it without interrupting him. She waited for the natural break and placed the words into it. Calm, not combative, simply present. Colton was quiet for a half-second. That was unusual. People who talked back to him, and there were fewer of them every year, usually did it with heat, with the visible anxiety of someone who knew they were overstepping and was doing it anyway. The anxiety was readable. It was something he knew how to handle. This was different. "Then use it," he said. He reached for her tray. Not roughly. The motion was controlled, practiced, the same motion he might use to redirect a piece of equipment that had ended up in the wrong place. Clinical, impersonal, efficient. Her hand was faster. She didn't grab his wrist. She didn't step back. She simply moved her tray 2 inches to the left in a motion that required her to shift her grip, and in the process, the coffee cup sitting at the tray's corner tipped. Time compressed for the people watching. The cup was going off the edge. The angle was wrong for a catch. The trajectory was clear. Avery's right hand came off the clipboard. The cup stopped. Perfectly. Completely. Not sloshing, not wobbling, not saved in the desperate, fumbling way that people save things they catch by luck. It stopped with the settled finality of something that had been placed there. Not a single drop on the tray. Not a single drop on the floor. The chow hall was completely silent. Colton Reeves stared at her hand around the cup. He had done 2 decades of close-quarters combat work. He knew reaction time. He knew what reflexes looked like when they had been built through thousands of repetitions under pressure. He knew the difference between a lucky catch and a trained response. That was not a lucky catch. Avery set the cup back on her tray. She looked at him. "Your mistake wasn't reaching for my tray," she said. Quiet. Unhurried. The kind of voice that didn't need the room to be silent but happened to have it. "Your mistake was deciding you already knew who I was before you asked a single question." The words landed differently than any challenge he'd been given in recent memory. Because they weren't a challenge. They were a diagnosis. Colton's jaw tightened. Not with anger exactly, though anger was in there, layered under something else that he wouldn't have named if asked. His pride had been a functional tool for his entire adult life. He had built it deliberately, the same way he had built everything else about himself, through repetition, discipline, and the consistent application of standards. The pride was not vanity, it was the operating system he ran on. She had just walked into it without a password and left a note. "You want to stand here and explain my mistakes to me," he said, low and flat. "No," Avery said. "I want you to understand the difference between authority and the habit of assuming it." She picked up her tray. She moved to the serving line. She served herself scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, black coffee. She found a table near the east wall, sat down, and opened her notebook. Around her, the chow hall slowly, carefully resumed its noise. Colton didn't go back to his quarters after the chow hall. He went to the ops center, ran the morning accountability report, attended the 0730 movement brief, and spent 40 minutes reviewing the maintenance log for the company's vehicle fleet without retaining a single word of it. He kept turning the encounter over. Not because it had shaken him. He had been challenged before, by soldiers with more rank, by civilians with more credentials, by situations that had actual stakes attached to them. This was a support staffer in an unmarked uniform who had said some pointed things over a breakfast tray. That was not the source of the irritation. The source was the reflex catch. He'd seen that reflex in 2 categories of people in his experience: elite athletes, who were rare, and combat-trained operators, who were rarer. The kind of reflex that didn't come from talent. It came from years of deliberate training under conditions that rewired the body's response time at a fundamental level. She didn't move like a logistics coordinator. She moved like someone who had been in situations where moving wrong had consequences. At 1100, between the morning's final brief and the midday meal, he did something he had never in 22 years of service done about a support staffer. He pulled up the personnel system and searched for her name. A. Sloan, GS11, Administrative Annex, arrived. He checked the date. 3 weeks ago. He found her entry. And then he found the wall. The file was there. The entry was real. But when he navigated to the assignment details, the document that should have explained her role at Fort Blackridge, her reporting chain, her tasking authority, there was a redacted block where those fields should have been. Not a system error. Not a missing attachment. A deliberate redaction, the kind that required a clearance level above what he had access to. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Colton had seen redacted personnel files before. They appeared in 2 contexts. The first was covert operations, personnel attached to units for classified purposes, whose records were sanitized as a matter of operational security. The second was inspections. He closed the browser. He sat in the empty ops center for 90 seconds. Then his radio crackled. "First Sergeant Reeves." The voice was Sergeant Major Holt, the battalion's senior NCO, calling from the command building. His voice had an edge in it that Colton had heard perhaps twice in 3 years. "Commander wants you in the conference room, now." Colton keyed his radio. "Copy, en route." He stood up, pulled on his cap, and for the first time in a very long time, he walked somewhere without being certain what he was walking into. Colonel Marcus Webb, the Fort Blackridge installation commander, was not a man given to visible emotion. He had 26 years of service, a face like weathered creekstone, and the particular stillness of senior commanders who had learned that in a room full of soldiers, the most powerful thing you could do was go completely quiet. He was quiet now. He sat at the head of the conference table with both hands flat on the surface, and he looked at Colton for a long moment before he spoke. "Walk me through this morning," Webb said. "Not a request." Colton sat down across the table. He removed his cap. He told it straight, the way he'd been trained to report. Chronological, factual, without editorializing. The line, the position, his assessment, his approach. What she said. What happened with the cup. Webb listened without interrupting. When Colton finished, the silence stretched for 5 full seconds. "She said you made an assumption before asking a question," Webb said. "Yes, sir." Webb's jaw moved slightly. Not a smile. Something adjacent to it that Colton couldn't read. "You looked her up," Webb said. It wasn't a question. Colton held eye contact. "Yes, sir. And you found?" "A redacted assignment block, sir." Webb nodded slowly. He looked at the table. Then he looked back up, and when he did, something in his expression had shifted in a way that made the back of Colton's neck go cold. "First Sergeant," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something before tomorrow morning's formation." Colton waited. "The woman in that chow hall," Webb said, "did not arrive here without my knowledge. She arrived here with my cooperation. And she has been on this installation for 22 days, conducting an evaluation that will determine whether this unit is authorized for the upcoming joint deployment." The room was very quiet. "Sir," Colton said. "She outranks me, First Sergeant." Webb's voice had no particular inflection on the words. He said them the way he would have said any tactical fact, clean and clear and without cushioning. "She outranks everyone on this installation. And tomorrow morning, she's going to walk into the battalion briefing room wearing the uniform she's been keeping in her quarters for the past 3 weeks. Colton's hands, flat on the table, did not move. Webb looked at him for another moment. "I suggest," the colonel said, "that you spend this evening thinking very carefully about what kind of man you want to be in that room." Colton left the command building at 13:47. He stood outside in the wind for a moment, which was cold off the high desert despite the season, and looked across the installation at the neat rows of vehicles in the motor pool, the running track where 2 rangers were putting in extra miles, the admin annex where the lights were still on in the corner office. He thought about the catch, the way she had moved, the complete absence of reaction when he stepped into her space. He had spent 22 years learning to read people. Threat assessment was not metaphorical for him. It was a practice skill with a survival component, tested in real conditions that had real consequences. He had looked at her. He had seen nobody. And the part of him that was honest, the part that existed underneath the rank and the record and the 22 years of being told he was right, that part understood, with a cold and specific clarity, that this had not been a mistake of assessment. It had been a mistake of attention. He had not failed to read her. He had not tried. He had categorized her in under 2 seconds. Plain uniform, no rank, standing where she shouldn't be, and he had acted on the category without bothering to look at the person inside it. He had done what he was trained to do in a firefight, where speed of assessment was survival, and he had applied it to a woman holding a breakfast tray, and he had been so completely wrong that it had taken a colonel to explain the scale of it. He walked back toward the company area. He did not go straight there. He took the long route, past the K9 kennels, where the Malinois he'd never learned the name of was being put through a post-shift assessment by his handler, the corporal with the quiet manner and the careful hands. The dog was running a scent trail, head low, moving with the focused economy of a working animal at the top of its training. Colton stopped and watched for a moment. The corporal glanced up, noticed him, went slightly still in the way that junior soldiers did around senior NCOs when they weren't sure what was coming. Colton looked at the dog completing its run. "What's his name?" he asked. The corporal blinked. "Ranger, First Sergeant." Colton looked at the dog for another moment. "He good?" he said. "Best nose on the installation," the corporal said, with the quiet conviction of someone who believed it completely. Colton nodded once. He kept walking. And somewhere behind him, in the admin annex corner office, a woman in plain fatigues opened her leather notebook and added 3 more lines. The final one read, "Day 22. He asked. She underlined it. Then she turned to the last empty page and began writing the outline of a report that would, depending on what happened in the next 48 hours, either approve or deny the deployment of 400 soldiers to a joint international operation. She worked until 2200. Then she opened her duffel bag, moved aside the worn paperback, and lifted out a folded uniform she had not touched since the day she arrived. She hung it on the back of the door. In the flickering overhead light, the decorations on it caught the glow. A dense row of them, the kind accumulated not through ceremony but through years of operations that had left marks on everything except the public record. She stood there for a moment, not looking at the uniform, looking at the door behind it. Tomorrow was going to be a very different kind of morning at Fort Blackridge. And First Sergeant Colton Reeves, who had spent 22 years being certain, was about to discover what it felt like to stand in a room and realize you had misread every line of the map. The uniform hung on the back of the door all night. Avery didn't sleep much. That wasn't unusual. She'd functioned on 4 hours for most of her adult life, a habit built during the years when sleep was a tactical luxury and rest was something you took in position with one ear open. She lay on top of the covers in the dark and listened to the installation settle into its overnight rhythm. The motor pool ran a generator test at 0130 that rattled the modular walls for 6 minutes. A vehicle moved through the perimeter road at 0322, headlights sweeping briefly across her ceiling. Somewhere in the transient block, 2 doors down, someone had a cough they couldn't shake. She was awake at 0445. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, elbows on her knees, looking at the floor. Not thinking about the briefing, not running through what she would say or how the room would react or what Colton Reeves's face would do when he understood the full shape of what he'd walked into. She had done that kind of preparation years ago. It had taken her a long time to learn that over-rehearsing a confrontation was its own form of weakness. It made you rigid, committed to a version of events that reality had no obligation to match. She showered, made instant coffee with the electric kettle that the transient block provided, and that she had used every morning for 3 weeks. Drank it standing up, looking out the narrow window at the dark installation, the distant lights of the vehicle maintenance base still burning. Then she took the uniform off the door. The process of putting it on was not ceremonial. She had done it hundreds of times. The uniform went on the same way it always did, methodical, systematic, each element in its correct order. Trousers, blouse, cover. The decorations were already pinned in their established positions, the arrangement fixed by regulation and years of practice. She didn't look in the mirror until she was completely dressed. When she did, she looked for approximately 3 seconds. Then she picked up her leather notebook, her coffee thermos, and her credentials, and she walked out the door. The air outside was cold, the particular cold of a Montana high desert morning in early fall, with a wind that came in from the north and meant business. The installation was in its pre-formation state, lights coming on in barracks, vehicles being staged, the smell of the Chow hall already active even at this hour. She passed 2 soldiers on the road between the transient block and the command building. Both of them glanced at her automatically, the way soldiers glance at everyone on an installation because situational awareness doesn't have an off switch. Both of them stopped. One of them actually paused mid-step. She kept walking. The battalion briefing room occupied the east wing of the command building, a space that had been designed for operational planning and ran to practical rather than comfortable. Rows of fixed seating facing a briefing platform, 2 large display screens, overhead lighting that flattened everything to the same institutional gray. It held 200 people with room to spare. It had been used for pre-deployment orders, after-action reviews, change of command ceremonies, and at least one formal inquiry that Avery knew about from reading the installation's internal records. It had never, to anyone's knowledge, been used for something quite like this. Colonel Webb had sent the formation order at 800 the previous evening. All personnel, Delta Company, and attached elements. Briefing room. No stated agenda. That kind of order, in Avery's experience, produced a specific type of overnight anxiety in a unit. Not fear, exactly, but the sustained alertness of soldiers who knew something significant was coming and had no way to prepare for it because they didn't know what it was. That was intentional. She arrived at 0650. Webb was already there, standing to the left of the briefing platform with Sergeant Major Holt and the company's executive officer, Captain Reyes, a compact and precise man who had the slightly over-controlled bearing of someone working very hard to appear relaxed. Webb saw her come through the door and straightened fractionally, not to attention, but with the unconscious adjustment of a senior commander in the presence of someone above his pay grade. He nodded. She nodded back. She took a position off to the side of the platform, back to the wall, and waited. The room filled in the next 8 minutes. She watched it happen, the Rangers filing in with the organized efficiency of a unit that moved as a body, finding seats, the background noise of collective presence filling the space. She watched faces. She always watched faces, not for specific expressions, but for the texture of a room, the way a group of people collectively carried themselves, the tells that existed below the level of deliberate presentation. She saw curiosity. She saw the contained wariness of soldiers who had received a no-agenda formation order and were running threat assessments on the situation. She saw, in the junior ranks, the sidelong exchanges of men who were trying to read their seniors' faces for information. She saw Colton Reeves come through the door at 0657. He was in his formal uniform, which told her something. She had expected him to come in his duty uniform, the choice that would have communicated business as usual, and the formal dress was either an instinct or a decision, and she wasn't sure which. He moved to his position at the front left of the formation with the automatic precision of a man who had stood in exactly this spot hundreds of times, and he did not look at her. That told her something too. The not looking was deliberate, carefully deliberate, in the way that deliberate avoidance always was. It required more attention than looking would have, because you had to continuously track the position of the thing you weren't looking at in order to keep not looking at it. She let it sit. At 0700, Webb stepped to the platform. "Take your seats," he said. The room settled. "This morning's formation is a command brief with one agenda item. I'm going to turn this over immediately, so listen up." He stepped back, and Avery walked to the platform. The shift in the room was physical. She felt it the way you felt a pressure change. Not dramatic, not loud, but present in a way that registered in the chest. 200 soldiers recalibrating in real time as the woman who had been, for 3 weeks, a face in the background of their daily operations walked to the front of the room wearing a uniform that communicated, in the precise and universal language of military insignia, a level of authority that none of them had been prepared for. She set her notebook on the podium. She looked at the room. She didn't open with an explanation. She didn't introduce herself or establish context or walk them through the discrepancy between what they had believed for 3 weeks and what was standing in front of them now. She simply began. "Delta Company's tactical performance over the past 18 months, she said, is not why I'm standing here." The room was completely quiet. "Your PT scores, your mission completion rate, your weapons qualification results. None of that is the subject of this evaluation." She opened her notebook. Not to read from it, to let them see that there was something in it, which was a different thing. "I'm here because Joint Readiness Command has a question that those numbers can't answer, and it's the only question that matters before we put this unit on the ground with allied forces from 3 other nations." She paused for a half second, let the silence do its work. "Are you the kind of soldiers that other people can trust?" The room stayed quiet, but the quality of the quiet changed. "Not trust with a weapon," she said. "Not trust to execute a fire mission or clear a structure or hold a perimeter. They already know you can do that. The question is whether you can be trusted in the moments between those things. Whether the South Korean liaison officer who briefs you tomorrow morning will be treated like a professional or a novelty. Whether the British logistics sergeant who coordinates your resupply feels like a partner or an afterthought. Whether the people on this installation who don't carry a rifle get treated like human beings or like furniture." She let that land. Then she turned to a specific page in her notebook. She read 3 incidents. She did not name names in any of them. She described what happened, what was said, and what the person on the receiving end had done, which in all 3 cases was nothing, because they had understood correctly that the power structure would not support them if they pushed back. The room's silence had changed again. It had the particular weight of a group of people hearing something true about themselves that they hadn't expected to be said out loud. "I've been on this installation for 22 days, Avery said. "I ate in your chow hall. I walked your motor pool. I sat in the back of your planning briefs. and what I found is a unit with genuinely exceptional capability and a cultural pattern that, under the wrong conditions, will get people hurt." She closed the notebook. "Not because you're bad soldiers, because somewhere in the last few years this unit decided that the hierarchy was permanent, that the people at the top of it had earned the right to stop looking at the people below it." She found Colton in the room without making a project of it. Their eyes met for the first time since the chow hall. "Yesterday morning," she said, "I was approached in the dining facility by a senior NCO who told me I was in the wrong line. He reached for my tray without asking a question first." She paused. "He wasn't wrong about the line. He was wrong about everything that came before he opened his mouth." The room was very still. "I am Senior Strategic Evaluation Officer Avery Sloan, Joint Readiness Command, GS-15. I've been conducting a cultural integrity assessment of Delta Company under Colonel Webb's cooperation since day one." She looked at the room. "And what happens in this unit over the next 72 hours will determine whether this company deploys." After she stepped back from the podium, Webb dismissed the formation with instructions for the company to report to their duty stations and await further guidance. The room moved with the controlled energy of a unit that had been handed something it was still processing. The noise level was lower than normal, the movement slightly more careful, in the way that people are careful when they're recalibrating the floor under their feet. Avery watched them file out. Captain Reyes approached her with a contained expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. He introduced himself, shook her hand, asked if there was anything she needed for the evaluation period. She told him she would need access to the full training schedule for the next 3 days. He said he'd have it to her within the hour. He was professional. He was competent. He was also, she noted, the kind of officer who was very good at managing situations once they had been identified and not always as good at identifying them. She didn't write that down. Not yet. Webb came to stand beside her as the last of the soldiers cleared the room. Holt had gone with them, which told her Webb had asked him to. "How'd they take it?" Webb said. "About how I expected," she said. I was quiet for a moment. "Reeves. He'll be fine." Webb looked at her sideways. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," she said. "There's a difference." She picked up her notebook and headed for the door. She had 3 observation sessions scheduled before noon and a stack of personnel evaluations that needed cross-referencing with the incident log. Behind her, Webb stood in the empty briefing room for a moment. Then he walked out too, and didn't say anything else. Colton spent the first hour after the brief in the company operations center, going through the movement log for the morning with a mechanical focus that had nothing to do with the movement log. Staff Sergeant Decker, his senior squad leader, came in at 0820 and dropped a supply requisition on the desk without being asked. Decker had been with the company for 3 years. He was one of the best tactical leaders Colton had worked with, aggressive in the right measure, steady under fire, loyal in the uncomplicated way of soldiers who had been through enough together that loyalty was just the baseline. He sat down across from Colton without being invited, which was one of the things Colton had always tolerated from him, because Decker only did it when he had something to say. "So," Decker said. "Don't," Colton said. "I'm not going to say anything." "You're already saying something." Decker was quiet for a moment. He picked up a pen from the desk, turned it over, put it back down. 22 days, he said. "I know." "She was in here 22 days and not one of us." I said, "I know, Decker." Silence. "The thing in the chow hall," Decker started. "Is done," Colton said. Flat, clear. The tone that ended conversations. Decker read it accurately and stood up. Took the supply requisition off the desk. Got to the door. He stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "she didn't use your name in there. She could have." Colton kept his eyes on the movement log. "She chose not to," Decker said. "Figure that's worth something." He left. Colton stared at the page in front of him. The words on it had stopped meaning anything. I was reading the same line for the 4th time and processing nothing, which was a state he had almost no experience with because his mind was not the kind that wandered. It was built for sustained focus on problems with solutions. Give it an objective, a set of constraints, and a time limit, and it operated at a level most people couldn't sustain. But this was not that kind of problem. The problem here was not tactical. He had stood in a room full of his soldiers and heard a woman describe the culture of his company accurately, clearly, and without anger, and the description had been, the honest word was damning, and Colton was too experienced to use softer language when harder language was correct. He had built this culture, not alone, not deliberately, but he had been the senior NCO of this company for 4 years. And the things that happen in a unit's culture happen because the senior NCO either shaped them or permitted them, and the distinction between those two was smaller than he had always believed. He pushed back from the desk. He went outside. The training yard behind the company area was in use, a junior squad running a CQB refresher on the shoot house framework, the crack of simulated rounds, and the noise of controlled movement reaching him across the open ground. He stood at the edge and watched without announcing himself. He watched them move. They were good. They had always been good. The footwork on the threshold entries was clean, the communication between stack members tight, the way they cleared angles systematic and fast. He had trained some of them personally. The muscle memory was his in some small way, passed down through repetition and correction over years of standing exactly where he was standing now. And he thought about what Avery had said. Not the public version. The statement in the briefing room that had been calibrated for a full audience. The version that had been calibrated specifically for him, delivered in the Chow hall in a tone that hadn't been loud enough for most of the room to hear clearly. Your mistake was deciding you already knew who I was before you asked a single question. He had been a first sergeant for 6 years. Before that, a platoon sergeant. Before that, a squad leader, a team leader, an 11B with boots so new they creaked, standing in a formation at Fort Benning in August heat, trying to look like someone who belonged. He remembered what it felt like to be invisible. He had forgotten. That was the thing he couldn't get around. He hadn't stopped believing in the value of support staff, of mechanics and cooks and handlers and admin specialists. He would have said, if asked, that he understood the operational value of every element on an installation. He would have believed himself. But belief and behavior had diverged somewhere, quietly, without a marked date, and the gap between them had grown wide enough that a woman could stand in it for 22 days and he hadn't noticed. From inside the shoot house framework, a junior ranger came around a corner too fast and blew his angle, overcame the threshold at the wrong moment, left his back exposed for a half second before recovering. His squad leader called it out immediately, sharp and precise. Reset. Do it again. You know what you did. The ranger reset. Did it again. Got it right. Colton watched. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Not approaching cautiously, not announcing themselves, just moving with the natural pace of someone covering ground. He turned. Avery Sloan was walking across the training yard with her notebook in her left hand, eyes on the shoot house framework, not on him. She moved with the same unhurried quality she'd had in the Chow hall, as if the space around her was something she occupied rather than moved through. She stopped a few feet to his right. She watched the drill. She didn't say anything. Neither did he, for a moment. The threshold problem, he said finally, nodding toward the framework. He's been overcoming it since the March eval. Good reaction, wrong timing. Avery watched the ranger reset for a second rep. Has he been told? Every time. And? He gets it right 9 times out of 10. She wrote something in her notebook. What are you writing? He asked. He didn't mean it as a challenge. It came out as something closer to genuine curiosity, which surprised him. That you know your soldiers, she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. He processed that. Is that good or bad in your report? He said. It's accurate, she said, which is what the report is. She watched the drill for another moment. The ranger ran the threshold again. Clean this time, tight footwork, correct angle, the squad leader silent, because silence was the confirmation. How long have you been doing this? Colton said. The assessment work. 9 years. Before that? She turned a page in her notebook. Before that, I was doing the kind of work that makes this work necessary. He heard the shape of what she wasn't saying. Operational? He said. She looked at him for the first time since she'd walked up. Brief, level, the kind of look that carried a complete sentence without using any words. Okay, he said. She went back to watching the drill. The briefing room, he said. You didn't use my name. No. Why not? She was quiet for a moment that was long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Because the incident was useful, she said finally, and you weren't the point. He stood with that. The wind came in from the north, pushing across the training yard, carrying the smell of the motor pool and cold air and the particular scent of an installation that ran around the clock and never quite cooled down. "What is the point?" he said. She closed her notebook. "Whether this unit can change," she said, "or whether it's going to spend the next 3 weeks convincing me it can change, which is a different thing." She walked back toward the command building. Colton stood in the training yard and watched the junior ranger run the threshold drill for a third time. Clean, then a fourth. Clean again. The next 48 hours moved at the compressed, over-deliberate pace of a unit that was aware of being watched, but hadn't yet figured out how to stop being aware of it. Avery saw it clearly. She had expected it. The first stage of any cultural assessment, once the subject unit understood the assessment was happening, was performance. The instinct to present the best version of the unit's behavior rather than the actual version. It was human, and it was predictable, and it was, in its own way, useful data, because what a unit chose to perform told you what it believed the evaluator wanted to see. What Delta Company performed in the 48 hours after the briefing was a version of itself that was careful. Rangers held doors. Rangers used measured tones with support staff. In the Chow Hall, and she watched this specifically, the informal priority line evaporated without a formal order, which told her something about how quickly an unofficial structure could shift when the authority that sustained it was questioned. But careful was not changed. Careful was the surface of a thing that hadn't been touched underneath. She saw it in the small moments. A corporal who held the motor pool door open but looked at the floor while he did it, the body language of compliance rather than consideration. A squad leader who included a maintenance specialist in a planning discussion but directed all his eye contact to the rangers in the room, the specialist's input acknowledged and immediately moved past. Two junior soldiers who saw her coming down a corridor and adjusted their conversation in a way that was too smooth to be natural. They had been saying something, and they stopped, and the silence that replaced it was shaped exactly like the conversation they'd been having. She wrote it all down. On the evening of the second day, she sat in the admin annex at 2100 with her evaluation documents spread across the small desk and the overhead light doing its 40-second flicker, and made a preliminary determination. The unit's tactical capability was not in question. The cultural shift was incomplete. More importantly, it was incomplete in a way that the unit didn't fully understand. They believed they were changing. They were not changing. They were monitoring their behavior, which was the first step toward change but was not the thing itself. The distance between those two was exactly the distance that got people hurt in joint operations. In the moments when monitoring broke down under pressure and the behavior that sat underneath it came back to the surface. She needed to see what sat underneath. She needed to find the edge of the performance. She needed, in the precise language of her methodology, a stress test. She pulled a blank evaluation form from the stack and started writing. The test she designed would not look like a test. It would look like an ordinary morning. And the person she needed to place at the center of it, the variable whose response would tell her whether the change was real, was not Colton Reeves. It was the person whose behavior Colton Reeves modeled for everyone below him, because that was how culture actually worked. Not top-down through orders, but lateral through imitation, soldiers watching their most respected leader and calibrating their own behavior to match. If Colton was performing, they were performing. If something was actually different in him, something would be actually different in them. She needed to know which one it was. She capped her pen, looked at the evaluation form. The stress test would run on day 3, beginning at 0600, and it would use an asset she had arranged before she arrived on the installation, an asset currently kenneled near the east perimeter of Fort Blackridge, waiting patiently with the particular patience of an animal trained to wait. His name was Ranger, and his handler, the corporal with the quiet manner and the careful hands, had been briefed 2 days ago and was ready. What none of them were ready for, not Colton, not Decker, not Captain Reyes or Colonel Webb or any of the 400 personnel on Fort Blackridge, was what the stress test would reveal about the one person on the installation who had been, until this moment, watching everything and saying almost nothing. Because Avery Sloan had a file too, a real one. And somewhere in the classified section of it, behind 3 security layers and a compartmentalization code that only 8 people in the current military structure were cleared to access, was the reason she understood Delta Company's cultural failure better than any outside observer should have. She had lived it, from the other side. She had lived it from the other side. That was the line she had written, and she stared at it for a long moment before she closed the evaluation form and put it face down on the desk. There was a version of this job that was clean. You came in, you observed, you documented, you wrote the report, you left. The unit either deployed or it didn't. The culture either shifted or it didn't. You moved on to the next installation, the next company, the next set of soldiers who needed someone to tell them the truth about themselves in a language that their own chain of command had stopped using. That version of the job was the one she described in briefings to Joint Readiness Command. The actual version was messier, because the actual version required her to carry, into every installation she walked into, the specific weight of knowing exactly what it felt like to be the person in the room that nobody looked at twice. Not as a theoretical construct, not as a methodology insight, as a memory with a date attached to it and a name she hadn't said out loud in 4 years. She stood up from the desk. She went to the narrow window and looked out at the dark installation. The memory was not useful here, she knew that. She had learned, through the particular discipline of doing this work for 9 years, to identify the difference between professional context and personal contamination, and to hold the line between them with the same precision she applied to everything else. But the line was thinner some nights than others. She turned away from the window, picked up the evaluation form, put it in her field bag. Tomorrow at 0600, the test would start. Corporal Jesse Tran had been a K-9 handler for 3 years, assigned to Fort Blackridge's attached detection element for the past 14 months. He was 26, slightly built in the way of men who moved quickly rather than heavily, and he had the particular economy of expression that came from spending most of his working hours communicating with an entity that didn't use words. Ranger, the Malinois, 4 years old, 71 pounds of working line genetics, and approximately 2,000 hours of certified training, was the more immediately impressive half of the partnership, in the way that all working dogs were more immediately impressive than their handlers to people who didn't understand what a handler actually did. What Tran did, specifically, was Red Ranger with a precision that bordered on the technical. He knew the dog's alert signatures the way a pilot knew instrument readings, not consciously, not through analysis, but as integrated data that his body processed faster than his mind did. What Ranger could do, in practical terms, detect 11 categories of explosive compounds at concentrations below 1 part per billion, clear a structure of approximately 3,000 square feet in under 4 minutes, and work for 6 hours in temperatures from -20 to 104 Fahrenheit without meaningful performance degradation. What most people at Fort Blackridge knew about Tran and Ranger, they were the K-9 element. They ate in the general line. They were occasionally useful. Avery had briefed Tran the evening of day 20, 2 days before the formal reveal, catching him at the kennel during Ranger's evening assessment run. She had shown him her credentials, the real ones, and explained what she needed. He had listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at Ranger for a moment, then back at her. "What if it doesn't work?" he said. "What if nobody reacts the way you're expecting?" "Then I write that down too," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The first sergeant," he said. Not a question exactly. "Among others." He nodded slowly. "Okay." "It might be uncomfortable," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile. "Ma'am, I've been on this installation for 14 months. She understood what he meant. "Okay," she said. "Oh." Day 3 of the post-briefing period began at 0542, when Avery's watch alarm pulled her out of the 4 hours she'd managed, and she sat up in the dark room and ran through the test parameters one more time. The scenario was simple. During the morning vehicle inspection at 0615, Ranger would alert on a vehicle in the motor pool. A real alert. Tran had placed a scent sample in a sealed training aid inside the wheel well of a LMTV the previous evening, cleared with the motor pool supervisor, a civilian contractor named Parks, who had been cooperative and discreet. The alert would be genuine. The response protocol required the area to be cleared and the vehicle flagged until EOD could verify and clear. The variables she was testing were not tactical. She wanted to see who helped Tran establish the perimeter. She wanted to see who questioned his judgment. She wanted to see what happened when a corporal with a dog said this vehicle is flagged to soldiers who outranked him. And she wanted to see what Colton Reeves did when he arrived on scene, as he would, because First Sergeant Reeves was always at the motor pool for the 0615 vehicle inspection, every morning, without exception. She dressed. She took her coffee thermos and her notebook, and she went to find a position with good sight lines to the motor pool that didn't read as observation. She found it in the maintenance bay doorway, which was partially open and gave her an angled view of the vehicle staging area without placing her directly in the scene. She checked her watch. 6:01. She waited. Ranger found it in 11 seconds. Tran walked him down the vehicle line at the standard inspection pace, the dog quartering in front of him on a loose lead, nose working the air in the systematic pattern of a train detection pass. The morning was cold and still, the kind of cold that made scent pool low and work in the dog's favor. The LMTV was the sixth vehicle in the line. Ranger's head came up. His pace changed. That particular compression of energy that preceded an alert, the body going slightly more deliberate, the nose dropping to source find. He moved to the wheel well. Sat. Clean, definitive, unambiguous. Tran keyed his radio. Motor pool K9 element. I have a positive alert on vehicle 6, the LMTV, wheel well, driver's side. Request the area be cleared per protocol, 100-meter perimeter. The radio response from Parks in the motor pool supervisor's office was immediate. Copy, K9. Initiating. What happened next was the variable. Parks came out of the supervisor's office and began moving personnel back from the vehicle line, which he was authorized to do, and which he did with the efficient calm of someone who had run drills for exactly this situation. 2 junior soldiers who had been conducting the morning check on the vehicles adjacent to the LMTV looked at Tran, looked at the dog, and moved back without comment. Then Staff Sergeant Decker came around the front of the vehicle line. He had been on the far side of the staging area checking a Humvee's fluid levels, and he came around the front bumper of the lead vehicle and saw Tran and Ranger and Parks and the 2 junior soldiers moving back, and he processed the scene in approximately 2 seconds. "What's the situation?" he said. "Alert on Vehicle 6, Tran said. Positive. Requesting perimeter and EOD notification." Decker looked at the dog, at the vehicle, at Tran. "You're certain," he said. There was a half-second where the question landed in the space between them. Tran was a corporal. Decker was a staff sergeant. In the informal arithmetic of the installation, that gap had historically meant that Decker's follow-up question was not actually a question. It was a gentle redirection, the kind that soldiers learned to deliver without the friction of a direct challenge. "He's certain," Tran said. His voice was even, not aggressive. "He's certified at .97 detection accuracy in the past 12 months. The alert is clean, and I'm calling it." Decker held for a moment. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Let's get the perimeter set. Martinez Chen, 100 meters. Tape the line. Move." The 2 junior soldiers moved. Avery made a mark in her notebook. It was a small mark, a check mark with a circle around it. She had a key for her notation system that she had developed over 9 years and that existed only in her handwriting, legible only to her. The circled check mark meant better than expected. Colton arrived at 0623. He came through the motor pool gate in his duty uniform, morning coffee in hand, and he read the scene in the way that first sergeants read scenes. Not by focusing on one thing, but by taking the whole picture in a single pass and letting the anomalies surface. The perimeter tape. The cleared vehicle line. Tran and Ranger at the center of it. Decker with his squad managing the boundary. He walked to the tape line. "Tran," he said. "First Sergeant." Tran's posture was correct, neutral, the careful neutrality of a junior soldier who had been through enough interactions with Colton Reeves to have calibrated his default presentation. "Positive alert on the LMTV. EOD notified. ETA 18 minutes. Colton looked at the vehicle. He looked at Ranger, who was still positioned at the alert site, patient and focused, the dog's attention fixed on the wheel well with the single-minded quality of a trained animal that understood exactly what its job was and was doing it. "Which element cleared the scent sample?" Colton said. "Training aid, First Sergeant. Motor pool supervisor authorized placement last night for the evaluation period." Colton's eyes moved to Parks, who was standing near the supervisor's office door with his arms crossed and an expression of cooperative calm. "Copy," Colton said. He ducked under the perimeter tape. Tran stepped forward automatically. "First Sergeant, The protocol. I know the protocol, Colton said. He wasn't dismissive about it. He kept moving toward the vehicle. First Sergeant. Tran's voice was flat. The perimeter is established under K9 detection protocol until EOD clears the vehicle. I can't authorize entry regardless of rank. The motor pool went very quiet. Decker was looking at the middle distance with the carefully maintained expression of a man who was not going to insert himself into this situation unless it became absolutely necessary. Colton stopped. He turned and looked at Tran. Tran looked back at him. He did not look comfortable. He was not trying to look comfortable. He was doing what the protocol required him to do, which was hold the line, and the effort of doing it was visible in the slight set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands on Ranger's lead. 3 seconds. 5. Colton stepped back to the tape line. He ducked back under it. Perimeter holds, he said to Decker. Nobody crosses until EOD clears. He looked at Tran. Good call, he said. It was 2 words. They were not delivered with warmth or performance. They were delivered the same way Colton delivered all tactical assessments. Clean, factual, moving on. But they landed in the motor pool with a weight that 2 words don't usually carry, because the people who heard them understood what they represented. From the maintenance bay doorway, Avery made a second mark in her notebook. 2 circles this time. Oh. EOD arrived at 0641, cleared the training aid in 11 minutes, and released the vehicle line at 0652. The whole incident had cost the morning's inspection schedule 37 minutes. Nobody complained about the 37 minutes. That was also a data point. Avery left the maintenance bay doorway at 0655 and walked back toward the command building to attend the 0730 staff call. She was halfway there when she heard boots behind her, not catching up exactly, but moving at a pace that closed the gap deliberately. She didn't turn around. Colton came even with her left shoulder. They walked in silence for a moment. You set that up, he said. The training aid was placed with the motor pool supervisor's authorization, she said. The alert was real. That's not what I asked. She kept walking. The test parameters are part of the evaluation methodology. You'll see them in the final report. I'm not asking about the report, he said. His voice had an edge in it, not angry, more like a man who had found the corner of something and was deciding whether to push on it. I'm asking whether you set me up specifically. She stopped. He stopped. She turned and looked at him. The morning light was flat and cold, the kind of light that didn't do anyone favors, and it showed the lines in his face clearly, the particular geography of a man who had spent 2 decades in conditions that left marks. You were going to cross the tape, she said. I know protocol. I know you know protocol. You crossed the tape anyway. He was quiet. That was the test, she said, not whether you knew the rule, whether you'd apply it to a corporal with a dog. His jaw moved. And? You stepped back, she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief, not vindication. It was something more complicated and less comfortable than either of those. That's not the same as respect, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. But it's the beginning of the question. She started walking again. He didn't follow this time. The staff call at 0730 ran 40 minutes and covered the week's training schedule, a vehicle maintenance backlog that was eating into operational readiness, and a communication from battalion regarding the joint deployment's updated timeline. The deployment date had moved forward by 4 days. They now had 14 days, not 18. Avery sat in the back of the room and said nothing. She watched Captain Reyes manage the update. He absorbed the timeline change without visible reaction, redistributed it across the planning elements, and assigned 3 action items before the meeting was done. He was efficient. He was genuinely good at the management of moving parts. She also watched the room absorb the 14-day information. The response was, in the broad strokes, professional. These were soldiers who had deployed on short notice before, for whom timeline compression was familiar terrain. But underneath the professionalism was a sharper edge than she'd seen in the previous 2 days. The compressed timeline was real pressure, not evaluated pressure, and real pressure did something that evaluated pressure didn't. It made people revert. She saw it in small things. A planning sergeant who interrupted a warrant officer mid-sentence in a way he wouldn't have done at the start of the week. Two NCOs at the back of the room having a sidebar in tones that were slightly too low to hear and slightly too energized to be casual. Captain Reyes glancing at Colton during one of the more complex planning exchanges, the instinctive look of a leader checking what his most experienced NCO's face was doing. Colton's face was doing nothing in particular. He was listening. I was tracking the details with the focused attention of someone who was already running the 14-day schedule in his head and sorting problems by magnitude. His posture was the same as it always was. Not rigid, not performative, just present. After the meeting, as the room cleared, he stayed in his seat. Reyes stopped at the door, looked back at him. Anything? The K-9 element, Colton said. Tran and Ranger. I want them in the deployment planning brief this afternoon. Reyes blinked. It was a small blink, controlled, but Avery caught it from the back of the room. We're operating in a joint environment with allied logistics chains we haven't vetted personally, Colton said. We've got a certified detection team on this installation who aren't in the planning picture. That's a gap. Reyes processed this for a moment. I'll add them to the 1400. He left. Colton sat for another moment. Then he looked at the back of the room, directly at Avery. She held his gaze. Write that down, he said. I already did, she said. The paper was not new. The edges were slightly curled from the air conditioning cycling, which meant it had been there at least a week, possibly longer. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she took a photograph of it and left. The 1400 planning brief was the most significant room Avery had sat in at Fort Blackridge. Not because of who was there, Webb, Reyes, Colton, the platoon leaders, the key NCOs, the planning cell, and now Tran in the back row with Ranger settled at his feet in a working downstay that most of the room was peripherally aware of. It was significant because it was the first time the deployment planning had incorporated every element of the company into the same room at the same time, support and combat arms together, for a purpose that made the inclusion operationally necessary rather than socially polite. Colton had done that. Not Avery. Not Webb. Not a directive from Joint Readiness Command. She sat in the back and watched him run the floor. He was good at this part. Not brilliant in the way of planners who could generate complex schemes on a whiteboard, but steady and rigorous in the way of a man who had field-tested his judgment enough times to know where theory broke down and what to do when it did. He walked through the deployment timeline, the personnel movement plan, the equipment readiness status. He asked specific questions of specific people and listened to the answers with the kind of attention that made people give better answers than they might have given otherwise. When he got to the detection and site security element, he looked at the back of the room. Tran, he said, walk us through your current certification status and what you need from us to be deployment ready in 14 days. Tran stood up. He spoke for 4 minutes. He covered Ranger's certification status, the compound categories they were current on, the training aid requirements for maintaining currency in a new operating environment, the logistics of transporting a working dog across an international movement. He spoke with the precise confidence of someone who knew his subject completely and had rarely been asked to present it to a room that was actually listening. The room was actually listening. Avery watched Reyes take notes. She watched 2 platoon leaders ask follow-up questions that were genuine. About integration, about protocol, about what it looked like when a detection dog alerted in a joint force staging area with 3 countries' worth of personnel and equipment in the picture. Tran answered all of it. At one point, Ranger shifted position at his feet, resettling with the easy confidence of a working dog in a familiar environment, and the room registered it with the small collective adjustment of people who weren't used to having a dog in a planning brief and were finding that they didn't mind. At 15:37, Webb called the brief. People began gathering materials and moving toward the door. Colton came to the back of the room. He stopped in front of Tran. Good brief, he said. Tran looked at him. Thank you, First Sergeant. A half second. The name of your dog, Colton said. Ranger, First Sergeant. Colton looked at the dog. Ranger looked back at him with the calm, steady attention of a working animal assessing a new element in his environment. How long has he been with you? 3 years, First Sergeant. Colton nodded once. He started to turn away. First Sergeant, Tran said. Colton stopped. Tran's expression was careful, not tentative, careful, in the way of someone who had decided to say something and was committing to it. This morning, at the perimeter. Thank you for stepping back. The room had mostly cleared. Reyes was near the door talking to one of the platoon leaders. Webb had already gone. Colton looked at Tron for a moment. "I should have done it without being told," he said. He left. Tron stood in the back of the empty room with Ranger at his feet and looked at the door for a moment. Avery, who was the only other person left in the room, made a mark in her notebook. This time she didn't use the key. She just wrote the word. Real. She worked until 2300. The preliminary evaluation form was almost complete. She had 93 documented observations across 22 days, 17 of which had occurred in the post-briefing period, and showed statistically meaningful shifts in the behavior patterns she had been tracking. The shift was not uniform. There were holdouts, there were performances that hadn't yet become practices, there were individual soldiers who were doing the math on compliance rather than engaging with the underlying question. But the aggregate was moving. And it was moving because of what had happened in the briefing room, and what had happened in the motor pool, and what had happened in a planning brief when a first sergeant looked at the back of the room and said, "A corporal's name," and meant it. She sat back. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The overhead light was doing its flicker. Outside, the installation had moved into its night rhythm, quieter but never quiet. She thought about the evaluation period's final stage. She had originally designed it as a 48-hour window. Given the timeline compression, she was going to need to compress it herself. 24 hours, final observation block, then the report. The report would not be simple. It never was. The binary of approved, not approved sat at the end of a document that was 30 pages long on a short evaluation, twice that on a complex one, and every page of it had to be accurate in the precise and defensible way that reports for Joint Readiness Command were accurate, because those reports informed decisions that had consequences beyond the installation where they were written. She pulled a fresh evaluation form. At the top of it, she wrote the unit designator and the evaluation period and the date. Then she paused. She thought about the bulletin board in the support staff common area, the curled paper with the single sentence on it, the anonymous handwriting that could have belonged to any one of 40 people who used that space. She thought about Holloway in the supply section with his perfect inventory and his 2 passed-over promotions. She thought about Okafor's email chain sitting in her field bag, showing a security vulnerability that had been accurately identified and carefully ignored. She thought about Tron standing at the perimeter tape with Ranger sitting at his feet, holding the line against 22 years of rank, because the protocol said to, and because he had decided, for that specific moment, that the protocol was worth the cost. She thought about Colton Reeves stepping back under the tape. And she thought about the version of herself that had existed 20 years ago, in a different unit at a different installation, holding a different kind of line, with no Colton Reeves to step back under it, and no one with a leather notebook to write down what had happened. The memory had a date. She kept it behind the same door she kept everything else that wasn't useful in the room she was currently in. She started writing. The final evaluation would require one more day, one more test. Not designed this time, not placed in the wheel well of a vehicle the night before. The last real test was always the same, in every unit she had assessed in 9 years of doing this work. It was the moment when something went actually wrong, not as a scenario, not as a training aid, but as a real, unscripted, uncontrolled situation that the unit hadn't prepared for. She couldn't design that, she could only wait for it. And at Fort Blackridge, on a base of 400 soldiers, with a compressed deployment timeline and a cultural reset in progress, and a communications vulnerability still sitting open in the radio net, she did not expect to wait long. She was right. At 02 Wharfine the following morning, her radio crackled. It was Tran's voice, flat, controlled, with the specific quality of someone reporting accurately while their hands were shaking. "Ma'am, motor pool, now. Ranger found something real." She was moving before Tron finished the transmission. Field bag. Boots. The credentials she kept on the nightstand because 9 years of this work had taught her that the middle of the night was when you needed them most. She was out the door of the transient block in 40 seconds, and the cold hit her like a flat hand. The Montana High Desert at 0214 was a different animal than the Montana High Desert at noon, the temperature having dropped 20 degrees since sundown, and the wind coming in from the north with nothing between it and her face for a considerable distance. She ran. Not the sprint of someone panicking, the measured, sustainable pace of someone covering ground efficiently in the dark, the kind of running that didn't cost more than it needed to. The motor pool was 300 meters from the transient block, and she covered it in a time that would have surprised most of the soldiers on the installation if they'd been awake to see it. They were awake. The motor pool lights were on, all of them, the full overhead array that made the vehicle staging area look like a surgical theater in the dark. Tran was at the near gate with Ranger, and beside him was Parks, the civilian motor pool supervisor, who had apparently been called first, and who was standing with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who was very awake and very unhappy about the reason. Two Rangers she didn't immediately recognize were at the perimeter, not because anyone had told them to be, but because they had been on the night duty rotation and had moved when they heard the alert. Avery came through the gate. "Talk," she said to Tran. "Standard overnight sweep," Tran said. His voice was controlled. His hands were not visibly shaking, but she could see the tension in them where he held Ranger's lead, the grip slightly tighter than his normal working hold. "I run Ranger on the vehicle line at 0200 on nights when I can't sleep. Not on the schedule, just I do it." "Okay." He alerted on the LMTV again. Avery looked at the vehicle. Same vehicle as the morning. Different wheel well, rear, driver's side. "Different position than the training aid," she said. "Yes, ma'am, and the alert signature is different. This morning he sat, tonight he went flat." She knew the difference. A seated alert was Ranger's trained response to a detected compound at moderate concentration. A flat, chin to ground, body low, was the signature he used when the concentration was high enough that his training protocol flagged it as an immediate proximity source rather than a residual trace. "Where's the training aid now?" she said. "In the kennel supply locker," Tran said. "I locked it myself at 1800. Parks spoke up. "Vehicle hasn't moved since the EOD clearance this morning. I've got the log." Avery looked at the vehicle. Then she looked at the gate. "Get EOD on the line," she said. "Now. And nobody touches that vehicle." She pulled out her radio. Colonel Webb arrived at 0231, which meant someone had called him before Avery did, which meant the information flow on this installation was faster than she'd given it credit for. He came through the gate in his PT clothes with a jacket thrown over them, and the expression of a man who had been through enough 0200 situations to have developed a specific face for them. Not alarmed, not slow, somewhere in the precise middle where competence lived. He looked at Avery. "EOD?" he said. "En route, 12 minutes. He looked at the vehicle. "You think it's real?" "Ranger thinks it's real," she said. "That's enough for me." Webb looked at Tran. "Your dog's record." .97 detection accuracy, sir. Certified quarterly. Webb processed this in about 2 seconds. "What do we know about who's had access to this vehicle since EOD cleared it this morning?" Parks opened his log. "Vehicle was released at 0652. Motor pool crew ran a fluid check at 1100. That's Hayes and Corporal Drummond. Staged for tomorrow's movement at 1430 by the same crew. Gate log shows no unscheduled entry to the staging area between 1430 and my 2200 lockdown check." "Between lockdown and trans sweep," Avery said. "Gate log has one entry, 2347. Supply run from the comms element. Specialist Okafor returning a piece of borrowed equipment." The name landed. Avery kept her face neutral. Okafor. The specialist who had flagged the radio net vulnerability 4 months ago. The one with the email chain she had photographed. She ran the connection in the back of her mind and kept it there, separate from the immediate situation, because connecting dots at 0230 in a motor pool without evidence was not analysis. It was storytelling, and storytelling got people hurt. "Get Okafor's duty status," she said to Webb. He looked at her for a half second. "That's a significant step," he said. "I know. Get it anyway." Webb keyed his radio. EOD arrived at 0243. A 2-person team from the installation's attached ordnance element, moving with the unhurried precision of people who had learned very early in their careers that hurrying toward a potential explosive device was a philosophy with poor long-term outcomes. The team leader was a first lieutenant named Garza, 29, with the particular combination of calm and thoroughness that EOD personnel either had naturally or developed very quickly or didn't survive long enough to discuss. She listened to Tran's alert description, looked at Ranger's current position. The dog had been moved back to a safe distance but was still orienting toward the vehicle with the focused attention of a trained animal that knew its job wasn't done. and she asked 3 technical questions about the alert signature, the detection duration, and the wind direction during the sweep. Tron answered all 3 precisely. Garza looked at her partner. Some communication passed between them that didn't use words. "We're going to need everyone back 60 meters, she said. They went. Avery stood at the 60-meter line with Webb on her left and Colton Reeves on her right. Colton had arrived at 0238, and she had registered his arrival without turning around because she had heard his specific boot pattern on the motor pool concrete, the slightly uneven cadence of a man with an old left knee injury that he had never fully disclosed on any medical record she had access to, but that was visible in how he moved when he was tired. He hadn't said anything when he arrived. He had read the scene, positioned himself at the perimeter line, and waited. That was, she thought, the most significant behavioral data point she had collected on Colton Reeves in 22 days. Not the Chow Hall, not the motor pool tape, not the planning brief. This, standing in the cold at 0238 in whatever he had thrown on, at the perimeter line, waiting, not pushing forward, not taking charge of a situation that wasn't his to manage, just present, available, letting the people who were qualified to handle it. She looked at him briefly. He was watching Garza and her partner work. His face was doing the nothing in particular that she had come to understand was not absence of expression, but a very specific kind of presence. The face of a man who was taking everything in and making no premature decisions about it. At 0301, Garza's partner called her to the rear wheel well. They conferred for 90 seconds. Then Garza stood up and walked the 60 meters to the perimeter line, and she looked at Webb, and she said, "Sir, I need you to contact the installation security officer and the FBI field office in Billings." The motor pool went very quiet. "We have a device," Garza said. "It's not sophisticated, but it's real and it's functional and it's been placed deliberately." The next 4 hours operated at the particular compressed intensity of a genuine security incident on a military installation, the kind of event that existed outside the normal rhythm of things and created its own timeline, its own chain of communication, its own hierarchy of decisions that had to be made in sequence and couldn't be made out of order. Webb managed the installation-level response. Garza and her partner secured the device. The FBI field office in Billings was notified and began the process of getting personnel on the road. Installation security locked the gate log and began working backward through the access records. Avery ran a parallel track. She pulled Okafor's record from the personnel system on her tablet, the full record, not the redacted version available to installation staff, which she could access with her credentials. She read it in the spare office off the motor pool supervisor's bay, while outside the window she could see the floodlights and the careful movement of people doing serious work. Specialist Marcus Okafor, 24, communications specialist, assigned to Fort Blackridge 14 months ago. Prior to that, 18 months at a signals intelligence facility in Georgia. Prior to that, advanced individual training. His performance evaluations were uniformly good to excellent. His flagged radio net vulnerability report was in the record, along with the routing history that showed exactly where it had gone and exactly where it had stopped. She read the routing history twice. The report had been logged by the installation communications officer. Then it had been forwarded, not to the maintenance element, not to the Cybersecurity Review Board, but to a lateral address in the administrative structure that she had never seen used for security routing in 9 years. She cross-referenced the address. It was a mailbox assigned to a contractor liaison position that had been vacant for 6 months. She sat with that. The vulnerability Okafor had identified was still open. It had been routed to an address where it would never be actioned. That was either profound administrative incompetence or something else. And the something else had a shape that she was not going to put in writing until she had more than routing data and a dog alert. But the shape was there. She photographed the routing record and sent it to a secure address that went directly to her counterpart at Joint Readiness Command Security Division. Then she went back to the motor pool. Colton was still at the perimeter line. Everyone else with nothing operationally critical to do had been redirected. Tron to the kennels to secure Ranger after the work was done. Parks to the supervisor's office to produce the full access log. The 2 duty rotation Rangers back to their post. Webb was on the phone near the gate. Colton was standing at the perimeter line with a cup of coffee that someone had produced from somewhere, looking at the LMTV. Avery stood beside him. Okafor, he said. Not a question. Don't do that, she said. He's the last gate entry. He's a data point, she said, not a conclusion. He was quiet. You know him, she said. He briefed me on the RadioNet issue 4 months ago, came to me directly after the formal channel didn't produce anything. He looked at his coffee. I told him I'd look into it. Did you? A pause. The kind of pause that answered the question. No, he said. I logged it and moved on. Avery looked at the vehicle. The vulnerability is still open, she said. He turned his head. Someone routed his report to a dead mailbox, she said. The vulnerability he identified is still live in your tactical radio net. She let that sit. Whether or not Okafor has anything to do with what's in that wheel. Well, this installation has a communication security problem that a 24-year-old specialist identified accurately 4 months ago, and nobody senior to him took seriously enough to fix. The silence stretched. That's mine, Colton said. Yes, she said. It is. He didn't argue it. He didn't qualify it or contextualize it or explain the operational tempo that had made it easy for the log entry to become background noise. He just held it, the way that honest people held things that were theirs to hold. What happens now, he said. EOD has the device. FBI is inbound. Installation security is working the access log. She paused. And I'm going to need to debrief every person who had access to this vehicle in the last 24 hours. Including Okafor. Including everyone, she said, starting with the motor pool crew and working outward. He nodded. I want to be in the room, he said. She looked at him. For the debrief, he said. Not to run it, not to manage the outcome. I want to be there. She considered it for a moment. There were reasons not to. The presence of the unit's senior NCO in a security debrief created dynamics that complicated the process, made junior soldiers more guarded, shifted the power balance in ways that weren't always useful. There were also reasons. You'll be quiet unless I ask you something, she said. Yes. If I tell you to leave, you leave. Yes. And when this is over, she said, you're going to personally supervise the closure of that RadioNet vulnerability. Not delegate it, not log it, you. Yes, he said. I know. What? The debriefs began at 043G and ran for 3 hours. Avery conducted them in the motor pool supervisor's office, which was small and functional and had a table with 4 chairs and a window that let in the pre-dawn light as the skies started to go gray over the eastern high desert. Webb was present for the first debrief as installation commander, then stepped out and ran his own parallel process with the security officer. She interviewed Hayes and Drummond, the motor pool crew who had run the fluid check at 1100. They were both straightforward, career enlisted, mid-grade, the kind of soldiers who had been doing this specific job long enough that their accounts of the morning's work were detailed and consistent in the way that genuine memories were detailed and consistent. They had checked the fluids, they had staged the vehicle, they had not opened any access panels, had not gone underneath, had not interacted with the wheel wells. She believed them. She interviewed Garza for 15 minutes about the device's construction and placement, not because she had forensic expertise, but because she needed to understand the access window the placement required, which Garza estimated at under 3 minutes for someone who knew what they were doing and had the materials staged in advance. She believed Garza too, but for different reasons. Then she interviewed Okafor. He came into the office at 0547, dressed in his duty uniform because someone had told him to dress before reporting. He was 24 but looked younger in the flat morning light, the kind of young that was less about age than about the fact that whatever he'd been through hadn't yet settled into his face the way it eventually settled into everyone's face. He sat down across from her. He looked at Colton, who was against the wall behind Avery's left shoulder. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture registered the presence and recalibrated slightly. Specialist Okafor, Avery said, I need you to walk me through your movements last night from 2200 through 0100. He did. He had finished his duty shift at 2130. He had eaten in the Chow hall. He named what he'd had, which was the kind of specific detail that people under stress either forgot entirely or remembered with unusual precision, and his precision read as genuine. He had gone back to the barracks, retrieved a borrowed signal amplifier from under his bunk that belonged to the motor pool's comms kit, and taken it back to the motor pool at 2347 because he had remembered at 2300 that Parks had asked for it back before the next morning's vehicle check, and he hadn't wanted to forget. He had logged in at the gate. He had walked to the equipment storage cage on the north side of the motor pool, approximately 40 meters from the vehicle staging area. He had signed the equipment back in on the cage log. He had walked out. He had not been near the vehicle line. "Did you see anyone else in this motor pool?" Avery said. "No, ma'am." "Did you pass through the staging area?" "No, ma'am. The storage cage is accessed from the north entrance. I didn't go south of the office building." Avery looked at him. He was nervous. She could see it in the way he was holding still, the particular motionlessness of someone who had understood that they were in a room where being nervous looked like something other than nervousness. But underneath the nervousness was something else, not guilt. She had been doing this long enough to know the difference between the stillness of someone concealing something and the stillness of someone who was frightened and was trying very hard to be clear. "Your report," she said. "The radio net vulnerability 4 months ago." His expression shifted. "Yes, ma'am." "Walk me through what you found." He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked her through it, technical, precise, the kind of explanation that came from someone who had been carrying the information for months and had not been given a real opportunity to present it to someone who had the background to follow it. He described the vulnerability, the discovery process, the scope of the exposure, the report he had filed, the follow-up requests he had made. "You came to First Sergeant Reeves directly," she said. "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "He said he'd look into it." She didn't look at Colton. "Did he follow up with you?" "No, ma'am." "Did you follow up with him?" "Once," Okafor said. It was a busy week. I didn't push." The word push landed in the room with a specific gravity. She wrote something in her notebook. "The routing of your report," she said. "It went to a dead contractor mailbox. Do you know how that happened?" He looked at her. "No, ma'am." And then carefully, "But I think someone wanted it to." The room was very quiet. "Why do you think that?" she said. "Because the vulnerability I found would let someone with the right equipment monitor our internal radio traffic without appearing on our net." He paused. "That's not an accidental gap. That's an architectural decision." Avery looked at him for a long moment. "Who else did you tell about what you found?" "Just the formal channel and First Sergeant Reeves." "Nobody outside the installation?" "No, ma'am." She believed him. She looked at Colton. He was looking at Okafor with an expression that she had not seen on him before, but not quite guilt, because guilt was too simple, and whatever Colton Reeves was built from wasn't simple. It was the expression of a man confronting the specific weight of a specific failure, not a general failure, not a systemic one, but a personal one with a date and a face and a consequence that was now sitting in front of him in the form of a 24-year-old specialist who had done everything right and had been failed at every turn by people who outranked him. "Specialist," Colton said. Okafor looked at him. "I should have followed up," Colton said. "I didn't. That's on me." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "Yes, First Sergeant," he said. Flat. Not angry, not gracious, just accurate. That was the right response, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of it sat between them in a way that was uncomfortable for Colton and probably necessary for Okafor, and useful for Avery in a way that she would have a hard time putting into the report, but that was real regardless. The FBI field team arrived at 0712. 2 agents, Valdez and Park, both with the quiet authority of federal investigators who had worked enough joint military cases to know how to enter an installation without creating friction. They went straight to Webb, who briefed them on the device and the access situation, and then they came to the motor pool supervisor's office, where Avery was compiling her debrief notes. Valdez was the lead. She was compact, direct, had the particular kind of exhaustion around her eyes of someone who had driven from Billings in the dark. "You're Sloan," she said. "Yes." "Joint Readiness Command sent us your preliminary." Avery nodded. "The routing record for the vulnerability report is in there. I want your forensics team to pull the mailbox access log. Whoever routed that report knew that address was dead." "Already flagged it," Valdez said. She looked around the office. "Your debrief findings?" "Okafor's clear," Avery said. "Motor pool crew is clear. The placement window is tight, Whoever did it either had access to the staging area after 1430 and before 2200, or they had access to the gate log and knew the gaps. Gate log access. Installation administrative system. Contractor level credentials can read it. Valdez looked at her partner. Park wrote something. The device construction, Avery said. How sophisticated? Not very, Valdez said, but functional. Someone with basic demolitions training and motivation. She paused. This wasn't an attack. This was a message. If it had gone off during the morning inspection, it would have damaged the vehicle and maybe injured whoever was closest. It wasn't built to kill. A disruption, Avery said. Or a test, Valdez said. See how the installation responds. Map the protocol gaps. Avery thought about the radio net vulnerability, the architectural gap, the dead mailbox. Someone has been watching this installation, she said. That's our assessment, Valdez said. We'll need full access to your evaluation documentation. You'll have it, Valdez nodded. She started for the door. Agent Valdez, Avery said. She stopped. The specialist who flagged the radio vulnerability. Okafor. She paused. He needs to be in your technical debrief, not as a subject, as a resource. He knows that net better than anyone on this installation. Valdez looked at her for a moment. We'll bring him in this afternoon, she said. After she left, Avery sat in the quiet of the supervisor's office for a moment. Outside the window, the sun was fully up now, washing the motor pool in flat morning light, the kind of light that made everything look exactly as real as it was. The LMTV was still taped off. 2 FBI personnel were working the vehicle with equipment that she didn't know the technical name for but recognized from 2 previous incidents in her career. Colton came back into the office. He had been outside during the FBI briefing, which she had neither asked him to do nor told him not to do. He sat in the chair across from her. He looked tired. Not the tired of sleep deprivation, though that was in there. The tired of a man who had been holding something since Eero 238 and had not been able to put it down. The vulnerability, he said. How bad? Okafor's assessment is accurate, she said. Someone with the right equipment could have been reading your tactical radio traffic for months. He absorbed that. The deployment, he said. Is still a live question, she said. This doesn't automatically disqualify you. How you respond to it does. What does that mean? It means in the next 48 hours, I'm going to be watching how this unit handles a real crisis. Not a scenario, not a training aid, a real one. She looked at him. And the first thing I need is for you to brief your company on the radio net vulnerability and stand up a temporary protocol by 1200. Using Okafor, he said. Who else? He nodded slowly. I need one more thing from you, she said. He waited. Your report on the Okafor follow-up failure, she said. Written, submitted to web, and to me by end of day. He was quiet. You want me to document my own failure, he said. I want you to document a specific gap in your command attention that contributed to a security vulnerability going unaddressed for 4 months and possibly gave someone an operational window to monitor this installation. She said it evenly, without emphasis, the way she said things that needed to be heard without the speaker's emotion coloring the hearing. That's not punishment. That's accountability. There's a difference. He looked at her. You've said that before, he said. The difference. It keeps being relevant, she said. He stood up. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. The bulletin board, he said. In the support staff common area. The note. She waited. I put that up, he said. 3 weeks ago. A pause. Before you got here. She looked at his back. He left. She sat in the empty office for a moment. Then she opened her notebook. She turned to the page where she had written real the night before, underneath the notation about Tran and the planning brief. She wrote one more word underneath it. Earlier than I thought. She closed the notebook. Outside the window, Okafor was walking across the motor pool toward the FBI team. He had a folder under his arm. His documentation, she guessed. The email chain. The technical details. Everything he had been carrying for 4 months and had not been asked to produce by anyone with the authority to use it. He walked with the deliberate pace of someone who had been told his work mattered and was not entirely sure yet whether to believe it. She watched him cross the motor pool and stop at the tape line, and she watched Valdez lift the tape for him without being asked, and she watched him duck under it and join the technical team on the other side. He opened his folder. He began to talk, and the people around him leaned in. Okafor talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Avery watched from the supervisor's office window for the first 20 minutes of it, then made herself stop watching and go back to work, because watching had become something close to the personal contamination she'd been guarding against all week, and she recognized the feeling and knew what to do with it. She went back to the evaluation forms. The full assessment document was 37 pages at this point, which was on the longer end of her normal range. Most cultural integrity assessments ran 22 to 28. The additional length came from the security incident, which required its own documentation stream, and from the specific texture of what she had found at Fort Blackridge, which resisted the cleaner lines of her standard framework in ways that she was still working out how to describe accurately. The problem with the standard framework she had understood by day 15 was that it had been designed to document failure. It was very good at that. It captured behavioral patterns, incident frequencies, power dynamic distortions, the ways that institutional culture could calcify around rank, until the people at the bottom of it became invisible to the people at the top. It was less good at documenting the specific, uneven, non-linear thing that happened when a unit began to actually change. Because change didn't look like the absence of the failure pattern. It looked like the failure pattern interrupted, by a decision made differently than the default, by a pause where there would have been a dismissal, by a first sergeant who put a note on a bulletin board 3 weeks before the evaluator arrived, and then forgot about it in the way that people forgot about things they had done without an audience. She was still thinking about that note. You don't need rank to be worth listening to. She had originally assumed it was reactive, someone's response to the Chow Hall culture, a small act of quiet protest from the support staff side of the installation's informal divide. That was the most obvious reading, and the most obvious reading was usually the one she went with until she had a reason not to. Colton had given her a reason. He had put it up before she arrived. 3 weeks before the Chow Hall incident, which meant before the evaluation, before the briefing room, before any of it, he had walked into the support staff common area and pinned a piece of paper to the bulletin board with a sentence on it that was either a genuine belief he had been carrying for some time or a performance he had been running without an audience. And of those two options, the one that was harder to explain was the one she was inclined to believe. She wrote for 2 hours. At 100, she submitted the RadioNet vulnerability closure order to Webb with Okafor listed as the primary technical lead for implementation. She attached the recommendation in writing, with her credentials on it, which meant the recommendation carried the weight of Joint Readiness Command behind it, and Webb had approximately no latitude to route it to a dead mailbox. Webb called her 12 minutes later. Okafor, he said. Yes, sir. He's a specialist. He's also the most qualified person on this installation to close the gap he found, she said. The rank is a number. The technical knowledge is the variable. A pause. I'll have Reyes brief him this afternoon, Webb said. First Sergeant Reeves will be doing the brief, she said, directly. That was his commitment this morning, and I'm holding it. Another pause. Shorter. Copy, Webb said. Wah. Colton's written report arrived in her field bag at 13:47, delivered by hand by Decker, who knocked on the admin annex door, held out the sealed envelope without comment, and left before she could say anything. She opened it. It was 4 pages. Single-spaced, which was not the standard format for an informal command report, and told her that he had written more than he'd intended to and hadn't been willing to cut it down. His writing style was direct and spare in the way that men who had spent their careers in operational environments wrote. No decorative language, no hedging, the sentences built to carry weight rather than to protect the person writing them. He documented the Okafor follow-up failure precisely. Date of initial contact. Content of the conversation. His decision to log it and move on. The operational context he had used to justify the deprioritization. Then one paragraph that she read twice. I have spent 22 years trusting my initial read of a situation. That instinct has served me and the soldiers under my leadership in environments where the cost of a wrong read was measured in seconds and lives. I applied that instinct to a specialist who brought me an accurate and important security finding, and I looked at his rank and his age, and I decided the problem could wait. That was not a tactical decision. That was a habit I had stopped examining. The cost of an unexamined habit in a unit's most junior member is a mistake. The cost of an unexamined habit in its senior NCO is a culture. She put the report down. She looked at the wall. She had read a lot of self-assessments in 9 years. Most of them were well-crafted documents that described mistakes in language specifically designed to minimize the appearance of the mistake while technically acknowledging it. That was human and predictable, and she had long since stopped being surprised by it. This was not that. This was a man who had sat down at some point in the previous 8 hours, while running a security response, while coordinating a radio net closure, while managing a unit that was operating under real pressure for the first time since she'd arrived, and had written something honest. Not because it would help his career, probably despite what it might do to his career, because it was accurate, and accuracy was apparently a value he held even when it was uncomfortable to hold it. She added it to the evaluation file. Then she picked up her notebook and went to find the last 3 people she needed to see before the report was complete. Holloway in the supply section was first. He looked up when she came in and did the small recalibration that people did when they saw her uniform now, post-briefing room, the rank insignia registering and adjusting the interaction before it started. She had stopped being able to prevent that. She could only try to move through it quickly. "I'm closing the evaluation today," she said. "I have one question for you." He waited. "Your promotion packages," she said. "The 2 you didn't submit after the first 2 cycles. What happened?" He looked at her steadily. "I submitted one. The first one. My rating chain signed it. It went up the chain and came back without a board interview." He paused. "Nobody told me why. I asked my direct supervisor. He said sometimes it just doesn't work out." "And the second cycle?" "I didn't submit." He said it without shame, without particular bitterness. Just fact. Seemed like a good use of everyone's time not to. She wrote that down. "I'm going to attach a command recommendation to your record," she said. "Joint Readiness Command Level. You'll see it in the system within 48 hours. He looked at her. "That's not why I'm here," he said carefully. "I know it's not," she said. "That's partly why I'm doing it." He was quiet for a moment. "The inventory system," he said. "There are 3 recurring discrepancies in the controlled items log that I've been flagging quarterly for 2 years. Nobody above me understands the system well enough to put it in writing," she said, "addressed to me directly. I'll have it reviewed by someone who understands the system." He looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded. It was a small nod. Not grateful exactly, more like the nod of a person who had been standing outside a door for a long time and had finally heard the lock click. Tran was at the kennels when she found him, running Ranger through a post-incident assessment routine, checking the dog's physical condition after a working night, the careful, systematic evaluation of a handler who treated his animal's condition as operational data. She watched from the kennel doorway for a moment. Ranger's ears came up when he registered her presence. He looked at her with the calm, assessing attention of a working animal. Not threatening, not friendly in the way of pet dogs, just present and alert and entirely itself. "How is he?" she said. "Good," Tran said. He ran his hands down Ranger's spine, checking muscle response. "He worked hard last night. He's earned a rest day." She crouched down, which put her at Ranger's eye level. He looked at her. She looked back. "You're in the deployment plan," she said to Tran without looking up. "Full integration. Reyes will brief you this week on your role in the joint operation." Tran's hand stilled on the dog's back. "As the detection element," he said. Not a question. He was making sure of the framing. "As a primary operational asset," she said. "Not an attached element. Primary." She stood. "The distinction matters. Make sure it's reflected in the movement orders." He was quiet for a moment. "The first sergeant asked me this morning," he said, "what Ranger's favorite toy is." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Kong," Tran said. "The orange one. He's had the same one for 2 years." He paused. "I told him. He didn't say anything, just nodded." She looked at Ranger, who had settled into a downstay and was watching the middle distance with the patient focus of a dog waiting to be told what came next. "Get some rest," she said. "Both of you." She left the kennel. The last person was not someone she had planned to see. She found Colton at 1600, standing at the edge of the training yard in the same spot where she had found him 2 days ago, watching the shoot house framework. The afternoon was cold and going colder, the sun dropping toward the western ridgeline in the way it did in the high desert, fast, like something that had made up its mind. She walked up and stood beside him. The shoot house was empty. The drill had finished an hour ago. He wasn't watching anything, which meant he was thinking, and the particular quality of his stillness said the thinking was the kind that happened when you had run out of tasks and the things you had been keeping busy to avoid were still there. She stood beside him for a moment without saying anything. "The report," he said. "When do you submit?" "Tonight." He nodded. "Am I in it?" he said. "The Chow Hall incident is documented," she said. "The follow-up failure on the radio vulnerability is documented. Your corrective actions over the past 72 hours are documented." She paused. "Your 4 years of building a tactically excellent unit are documented. It's a complete picture." "And the recommendation." She looked at the empty shoot house framework. "I'm recommending Delta Company for deployment," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "With conditions," she said. "Mandatory cultural integration training before the joint exercise. Okafor co-leads the radio net security implementation and receives a formal commendation in his record. The K9 element operates as a primary asset, not an attached one, for the duration." She paused. "And you submit a quarterly command culture report to Webb for the 12 months following deployment, self-assessment format, no template." "You're going to make me keep writing," he said. "I'm going to make you keep looking," she said. He was quiet again. The wind came in from the north, same as it had been coming in all week, cold and direct and indifferent to what was happening beneath it. "The night you arrived," he said. "You drove yourself from the airport." "Yes." "No escort, no introduction to the command. You just showed up." "That's the protocol," she said. "If the installation knows an evaluator is coming, they clean the windows before you get there. You never see the actual house." He thought about that. 22 days, he said. 22 days. "And you were watching all of it." "All of it," she said. "The good and the rest of it." He turned his head and looked at her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She waited. "The evaluation, the methodology, the coming in quiet, the watching. The way you let the Chow Hall happen without stopping it." He paused. "Does it bother you? Letting it play out when you could stop it?" She looked at the shoot house. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes." "But you do it anyway." "Because what I stop in the moment doesn't change what generates it," she said. "If I'd identified myself in the Chow Hall, you would have apologized, and the unit would have straightened up, and I would have written a report about a unit that performed correctly when they believed they were being evaluated." She paused. "That report wouldn't have told anyone anything useful." He was quiet. "The note on the bulletin board," she said. He looked at her. "Why did you put it up?" she said. "Before I arrived. Before any of this." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I had a soldier," he said finally, 4 years ago, before I came to this company. Private first class, motor transport, quiet kid. Never caused problems. Did his job correctly every day." He paused. He reported something to his squad leader, a safety violation in the vehicle maintenance protocol. His squad leader told him to mind his lane. He stopped. She waited. 3 weeks later, he said, a vehicle went down during a road movement. Mechanical failure. The exact failure the private had flagged. He paused. Nobody was killed. One soldier had a broken arm and a concussion that gave him headaches for the rest of his enlistment. He looked at the training yard. The private put in his separation paperwork 6 weeks after that. I processed it myself. He didn't say anything in the exit interview. He just left. The sky to the west had gone orange and pink, the dramatic sunset of the high desert that happened every evening, and that Avery had barely looked at once in 22 days. "I didn't put that note up because I thought it would fix anything," he said. "I put it up because I needed to see it." She looked at him. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me," she said. He didn't disagree. "The report goes up tonight," she said. "The deployment authorization will come through Webb within 24 hours. Your people will know by end of week." She turned to leave. "Sloan," he said. She stopped. "What you said in the Chow Hall, the first morning," he paused, "about the difference between authority and the habit of assuming it." She waited. "I've been thinking about that for 4 days," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew I would be." "It's why I said it that way," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not a smile, something that lived in the same neighborhood as one, but was quieter and more complicated. The expression of a man who had been handed an uncomfortable truth and had decided to keep it rather than set it down. She walked back toward the command building. The report took 4 hours to finalize. She worked through dinner, through the installation's evening shift change, through the point where the overhead light began its 40-second flicker, and she finally, after 22 days, reached up and tightened the bulb in the fixture and the flicker stopped. She submitted the document at 21/47, 39 pages, 97 documented observations, a security incident addendum that would go to the FBI team as a parallel filing, 3 formal commendation recommendations, Okafor, Tran, Holloway, 1 conditions-based deployment authorization. She sat in the quiet for a moment after she hit send. Then she opened her field bag and began packing. The worn paperback went in first, the leather notebook, the toiletry bag, 2 sets of plain unmarked fatigues that she would wash and return to the travel rotation, the formal uniform, folded with the precision of long habit, placed on top. She was done by 22:30. She carried the bag to the door and set it down and stood in the empty room for a moment. 9 years of this work, 14 installations, 11 deployment authorizations, 2 refusals, 1 conditional authorization that had been upgraded to full after a 6-month follow-up evaluation. She had written hundreds of pages of reports that described, in precise and defensible language, the ways that human beings inside institutional structures failed each other. Not from cruelty, usually, but from something more ordinary and more persistent. The habit of hierarchy. The assumption that power and worth were the same measurement. The slow and visible calcification of a culture around the people inside it, until the people at the top genuinely could not see the ones at the bottom. Not because they were blind, but because they had stopped trying to look. She had been the person at the bottom once. She was allowed to remember that. She picked up her bag. She turned off the light. The white government sedan was in front of the admin annex at EO 600, the driver a quiet specialist from the installation's administrative pool who loaded her bag in the trunk without comment and opened the passenger door and waited. She was halfway to the vehicle when she heard boots. She turned. Colton was walking across the road between the barracks and the admin annex. He was in his duty uniform, morning coffee in hand, the same way she had first seen him in the Chow hall, moving with the deliberate economy of a man who knew exactly how much energy each step required. He stopped a few feet from her. In the early light, he looked tired, which was fair. He also looked like someone who had made a decision overnight and was comfortable with it, which was something she hadn't seen in him before. He held out a small notebook. She looked at it. It was the same size as her leather notebook, the kind available at any office supply store. Nothing distinctive about it. But it was worn in the way that things worn from use rather than age were worn. "I've been keeping that since the private left," he said. "Things I should have caught earlier, decisions I made faster than I should have." He paused. "I'm starting a new one." She looked at the notebook. "Keep it," she said. He held it for a moment. "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to see it existed." She looked at him. He held her gaze in the flat morning light, steady and without performance, the way he had been steady throughout the last 4 days in the moments when it had mattered. Not perfectly, not without stumbling, but with the genuine effort of a man who was trying to see something he had spent a long time not seeing. "First Sergeant," she said. "Ma'am, you didn't ask why I didn't destroy your career," she said. "In the report, you haven't asked once." He was quiet. "Because I don't think that was your job," he said. "It would have been within my authority." "I know." "And you don't want to know why I didn't." He looked at her. "I think I know why," he said. "I think you were looking for what happened after the mistake. Not the mistake." She held his gaze for a moment. "Take care of your people," she said. "All of them. The ones with rifles and the ones without." "Yes, ma'am." She got in the sedan. She did not look back when it pulled out of the gate, because looking back was a habit she had broken a long time ago and had no intention of rebuilding. But she heard, as the vehicle moved through the gate and onto the road that ran north toward the highway, the sound of the installation waking up behind her, the distant noise of formation, boots on pavement, the particular collective presence of 400 people beginning another day. and she let herself hear it for a moment before she opened her notebook and turned to a blank page. She wrote the date. Below it, she wrote the installation designation and the unit and the evaluation code. Below that, she wrote one line that would not appear in any report. They looked. Eventually. That's where it starts. She put the cap on her pen. Outside the window, the Montana high desert ran flat and cold toward the horizon, the early light doing what it always did out here, making everything look exactly as large and unforgiving and honest as it was. She had another installation in 11 days. She would go in quiet. She would wear plain fatigues with no insignia, and she would watch how they treated the people they believed had no power, because that was the only test that ever told the truth. The measure of a person, and the measure of the culture they build, is never found in how they treat those who can hold them accountable. It is found in how they treat those who cannot. Every title fades, every rank eventually passes, every room where you once held authority will one day hold someone else. What remains is the simple human record of how you behaved when no one important was watching. Choose to look twice. Choose to ask before you assume. The person you dismiss without a second glance may carry something you cannot afford to overlook, or they may simply be a person, which has always been enough.